Emily is the least well-known of the Brontë sisters. She died at the age of 30, having published one major work, Wuthering Heights, a strange, rambling Gothic masterpiece that puzzled and dismayed critics at the time who were troubled by its moral ambiguity. Like her novel, Emily was also regarded as strange, solitary, uncompromising, uninterested in small talk or social conventions, and either painfully shy or bluntly antisocial. Her brilliant portrayal by Emma Mackey in the recent film Emily gives one possible version of her life, although sadly there is no evidence for her passionate affair with... but I'd better not spoil it, in case you haven't seen the film yet. I'm Professor Graeme Yorston, and today I'm going to be exploring the life and inner world of Emily Brontë, trying to work out if her strangeness was just the eccentricity of creative genius, or something else, an autistic spectrum disorder perhaps. Emily was born in 1818 in Yorkshire, at the height of the Industrial Revolution that was transforming British society. Her father was a poor Irishman, Patrick Brontë, who was an apprentice blacksmith before becoming a teacher and then winning a scholarship to Cambridge to become an Anglican priest. He changed his name to Brontë in adult life and published several collections of poems. Her mother was Maria Branwell, the daughter of a prominent Cornish Methodist merchant, a much wealthier background than her husband's. But it is clear from her letters and published essay on the advantages of poverty in religious concerns that she valued piety and faith above money. Emily was the second youngest of their 6 children, and before her second birthday in 1820, the family moved to Haworth, a remote village on the edge of the Yorkshire moors, where her father was offered the position of perpetual curate, a kind of second-class vicar for men of more humble origins and much less lucrative than the top Anglican jobs. It still came with a substantial parsonage, however, now the Brontë Museum of course, and whilst the Brontës were not rich, they were certainly not poor by the standards of the time. When Emily was 3, her mother died. Her older sisters were sent to the clergy daughters' school 40 miles away at Cowan Bridge in Lancashire, and her aunt, Elizabeth Branwell, moved in to look after the younger children. 3 years later, Emily was sent to join her sisters at the school for a brief period. This is her entry in the school register. Reads very prettily and works a little. But it was a brutal, soulless place, run by a tyrannical Calvinist, and when typhus broke out, the girls returned home. Typhus is a bacterial infection spread by fleas and lice, and it was a major killer in the 19th century. Epidemics associated with famines in Ireland led to it being referred to as Irish fever. Her sisters, Maria and Elizabeth, were ill and died shortly afterwards. And Charlotte always maintained that her health was never the same after attending the school. Fortunately, their father and aunt decided to take over the children's education, and they had access to a wide range of books and periodicals, from the established classics to more radical works by 19th century bad boys Byron and Shelley. The only son of the family, Branwell, was given a box of toy soldiers for his 9th birthday, and this inspired the children to start writing poems and stories about them in tiny books which they set in colourful imaginary worlds. At first, they all joined in creating the stories, but when Emily was 13, she and Anne, feeling somewhat left out as they were younger, began a new set of stories about Gondal, a North Pacific island of moorlands and snow, peopled by noble savages. Creating the myths and legends of this fantasy world would occupy the 2 sisters throughout their lives. Even in their mid-20s, long after convention would have demanded that they cast off such childish pursuits, we know that Emily and Anne spent time acting out some of their Gondal characters on a trip to York. At 17, Emily began attending Roe Head Girls' School, a day's ride away in a village near Huddersfield, where Charlotte was a teacher. But she had to leave after only a few months as she developed extreme homesickness. Charlotte wrote later that
Liberty was the breath of Emily's nostrils. Without it, she perished. The change from her own home to a school, and from her own very noiseless, very secluded but unrestricted and unartificial mode of life to one of disciplined routine, though under the kindest auspices, was what she failed in enduring. I felt in my heart she would die if she did not go home.
If this sounds rather melodramatic to us today, it is because we no longer consider homesickness to be a life-threatening illness. But at the time, it was a recognised medical condition, initially described in Swiss soldiers by Johannes Hofer in 1688 and termed nostalgia. It was characterised by sadness, obsession with the idea of home, and anguish, as well as disturbed sleep, loss of appetite, palpitations, weakness and fever. It was thought that if those afflicted were not allowed to return home, their symptoms could progress to stupor, which could even end in death. So her sister's fears would have been considered entirely reasonable at the time. With no inheritance to rely on, the Brontes hoped to obtain sufficient education to be able to open a small school of their own. And to this end, Emily took up a position as a teacher at Law Hill School in Halifax when she was 20. But this didn't work out either, and she lasted only 7 months, unable to cope with being away and the 17-hour working day. For the next 4 years she remained at home, doing most of the household chores at the parsonage, continuing her studies and practicing the piano. In 1842, Emily and Charlotte travelled to the newly independent Kingdom of Belgium to enrol in a girls' academy in the hope of perfecting their French and German. But right from the outset, Emily clashed with the head of the school, Constantin Heger, over his method of teaching. He proposed reading passages from masterpieces of French literature for the sisters to analyse, discuss and write essays on. Emily told her sister that she saw no good to be derived from it, and that by adopting it they should lose all originality of thought and expression. However, despite her objections, she complied, and 10 of her essays survive, giving an important insight into her creative writing. Her rather pessimistic and cynical view of mankind, and her awareness of the cruelties of the world she lived in, impressed Monsieur Heger, who wrote, "She should have been a man, a great navigator. Her powerful reason would have deduced new spheres of discovery from the knowledge of the old, and her strong, imperious will would never have been daunted by opposition or difficulty. Never have given way, but with life. She had a head for logic and a capability of argument unusual in a man and rarer indeed in a woman. Impairing this gift was her stubborn tenacity of will, which rendered her obtuse to all reasoning where her own wishes or her own sense of right was concerned." The initial plan was to stay in Brussels for only 6 months, but the Hegers suggested they stay on for longer and offered them teaching posts in exchange for free board and education. Charlotte wrote in a letter,
Emily is making rapid progress in French, German, music and drawing. Monsieur and Madame Heger begin to recognise the valuable parts of her character under her singularities.
The prospect of remaining longer in Brussels must have been painful to Emily, but she was determined to prove that she could stay away from home, however unpleasant the experience and however homesick she felt. She studied relentlessly and practiced the piano, but gradually became even quieter and more inaccessible than usual. She didn't eat, she slept poorly, and she started to look ill. Charlotte saw her physical decline as she had at Rowhead School.
Once more she seemed sinking, but this time she rallied through the mere force of resolution. With inward remorse and shame, she looked back on her former failure and resolved to conquer it in this second ordeal. She did conquer, but the victory cost her dear.
She was saved perhaps by the news that their aunt was seriously ill and that they would have to return home. The following day they heard she was already dead. Back in Haworth they assumed the role of looking after their father and reining in their wayward brother Bramwell, who had been dismissed from his job as a railway clerk and was drinking heavily and using opium. In 1844 the sisters attempted to open their school in the parsonage, but they were unable to attract pupils to such a remote spot. Around this time, Emily began going through all the poems she had written, copying them neatly into 2 notebooks. Charlotte discovered the notebooks and suggested that the poems be published to help the family's precarious finances, but Emily was furious at the invasion of her privacy and refused. However, when Anne brought out her own manuscripts and revealed that she too had been writing poems in secret, Emily agreed. In 1846, the 3 sisters' poems were published in a single volume with male pseudonyms because of a vague impression that authoresses are liable to be looked on with prejudice. Charlotte contributed 19 poems, Emily and Anne 21 each. The collection received positive reviews. The Athenaeum praised Ellis Bell's work, i.e. Emily's, in particular, for its music and power. But it didn't make them rich, selling only 2 copies. The sisters, however, were not discouraged and each immediately embarked on writing a novel. Emily's masterpiece Wuthering Heights was published in London in 1847, appearing as the first 2 volumes of a 3-volume set that included Anne's novel Agnes Grey, using the same pseudonym of Ellis Bell. The novel's innovative structure puzzled critics, and it received mixed reviews. Some condemned its portrayal of amoral passion. The Athenaeum, so enthusiastic about the poems, considered it a disagreeable story. In America, Graeme's magazine wrote, "How a human being could have attempted such a book as the present without committing suicide before he had finished a dozen chapters is a mystery. It is a compound of vulgar depravity and unnatural horrors." Others, however, recognised its raw power, and it has subsequently come to be regarded as one of the greatest books ever written. But Emily died a year after its publication, aged only 30, and never got to know of its elevation to classic status. She followed just a few months after her brother Bramwell died after years of alcohol and opium addiction, and nearly burning the house down when he set light to his bed. At his funeral in September 1848, Emily caught a cold that quickly developed into inflammation of the lungs and tuberculosis. Though her condition steadily worsened, she rejected all remedies and medical help, saying that she would have
no poisoning doctor
near her. On the 19th of December 1848, she got up and dressed herself, refusing any help from her sisters and doing her best to contribute to the household chores. Growing weak and only able to whisper, she said to Charlotte,
"If you will send for a doctor, I will see him now."
But it was too late. She had grown so thin that her coffin measured only 16 inches wide, and the carpenter said that he had never made a narrower one for an adult. Coming so soon after Bramwell's death led Martha Brown, a housemaid, to declare that Miss Emily died of a broken heart for love of her brother. Did she pine away for the loss of her brother, or for someone we know not of? Or was it simply the ravenous consumption of her body by Mycobacterium tuberculosis, still unknown to medical science at this time, that ended her fragile existence? Tempting though it is to imagine her fading away through grief and loss, we must remember that in the 19th century tuberculosis caused half of all deaths of people in their 20s. It was called the robber of youth and the White Death because of the extreme anemic pallor of those affected. But somehow it was seen as a romantic disease, with the slow, inevitable decline of consumptives being associated with heightened sensitivity and spiritual redemption. Emily's hero, Byron, once announced that he should like to die from consumption. And the echoes of this romantic view of what was, in reality, a relentless and bleakly unromantic disease can be seen in Puccini's opera La Bohème and the film Moulin Rouge. So we know what ravaged her body, but can we get a little closer to the elusive Emily to understand what went through her mind? It is difficult. Even though the lives of the Brontë sisters are incredibly well documented, Emily herself did not leave hundreds of letters or detailed diaries, and the little we do know comes largely from her sister Charlotte. In the preface to the second edition of Wuthering Heights in 1850, Charlotte wrote,
My sister's disposition was not naturally gregarious. Circumstances favoured and fostered her tendency to seclusion. Except to go to church or take a walk on the hills, she rarely crossed the threshold of home, though her feeling for people around was benevolent. Intercourse with them she never sought, nor, with very few exceptions, ever experienced. And yet she knew them, knew their ways, their language, their family histories. She could hear of them with interest and talk of them with detail, minute, graphic and accurate, but with them she rarely exchanged a word.
Charlotte also said that Emily's reason often travelled a different road from her own. Some biographers have regarded this as deliberate mythologising by Charlotte, who exaggerated or fabricated Emily's frailty and shyness to cast herself in the role of maternal saviour. Others have suggested that Charlotte created a smokescreen to hide Emily's shocking behaviour and loose grasp on sanity to make her character, history and poems more acceptable to the bourgeois reading public. But what if Charlotte's portrayal is neither exaggeration nor understatement, but an accurate description of Emily's unusual personality? Are there any other sources that highlight her singular character traits? Ellen Nussey, lifelong friend of her sister Charlotte and frequent visitor to Haworth, confirmed that Emily had few friends outside the family and that her closest companion was her sister Anne.
They were like twins, inseparable companions, and in the very closest sympathy which never had any interruption.
We know that she struggled away from home. Brussels, her longest period away from Haworth, was never going to be easy. Emily and Charlotte were different from the other girls, older and Protestant in upbringing and outlook. But whilst Charlotte tried to adapt to the niceties of Belgian society, Emily steadfastly refused to change in any way. Charlotte adopted the new continental dress style, but Emily persisted with her rather dowdy clothes, and when she was teased, she retorted,
"I wish to be as God made me."
Emily had no interest in meeting her fellow pupils' families, so her only contact with people outside the school was a small circle of English expatriates. Mr. Jenkins, an Anglican cleric at the rather grand Protestant church, opened his house to them on Sundays. But his wife stopped inviting them after a while, as their shyness and awkwardness made the visits painful to endure, much to the relief of their sons, who found their task of escorting the silent girls mind-numbingly tedious. Mrs. Jenkins observed that Emily hardly ever uttered more than a monosyllable when she was in their home, and she rapidly grew weary of the impenetrable, silent mask Emily presented to the world. We also know that on an outing for tea with another family, Emily remained completely silent the whole evening. And later, when the 5 daughters of British doctor Thomas Wheelwright started at the school and tried to make friends with the sisters, they found Emily difficult. They liked Charlotte and wanted to invite her home and on excursions, but they did not do so because they knew Emily would have to be invited and would ruin the occasion. They felt that Emily bullied her sister and held Charlotte in a possessive grip, cutting her off from everyone else by her unwillingness to compromise and fit in. The only exception to this unfavourable consensus was Louise de Bassompierre, a 16-year-old fellow student who actually preferred Emily to her sister, finding her more sympathetic, kinder and more approachable. On her part, Emily must have valued her friendship, as she gave her this drawing of a fir tree. Every account of Emily's life highlights her love of nature. New York's Literary News in 1883 told of how she loved the solemn moors and all wild free creatures. This was long after her death, of course, when her mythic status was already firmly established. But the contemporary accounts agree that she loved walking on the moors and had an affinity with animals and a particularly close bond with her dog Keeper. Countering this somewhat, Elizabeth Gaskell, in her biography of Charlotte Brontë, tells of how Emily cruelly punished her dog for lying on a white counterpane that covered one of the beds, according to Gaskell, she struck him with her fists until he was half blind and his eyes swelled up. It has been suggested that this story might be apocryphal, as her servant never witnessed anything like it, but it could be true, suggesting a possible propensity for aggression towards those she loved most, when sufficiently triggered. Eva Hope, a biographer of worthy Victorians, summed up Emily's character in 1886 as
a peculiar mixture of timidity and Spartan-like courage. She was painfully shy, but physically she was brave to a surprising degree. She loved few persons, but those few with a passion of self-sacrificing tenderness and devotion. To others' failings she was understanding and forgiving, but over herself she kept a continual and most austere watch, never allowing herself to deviate for one instant from what she considered her duty.
As a 21st century psychiatrist, I think there's little doubt that Emily was different. She was solitary, inflexible and resistant to change. She was unaware of or unconcerned about social conventions or other people's opinions of her. But she was a talented artist, musician and writer, of course. She seemed to prefer living in the orderly and predictable fantasy world of her own creation, or wandering the windswept and desolate Yorkshire moors, rather than engaging in the pointless chitter-chatter of polite society. To me, this suggests that she may have had an autistic spectrum disorder, or ASD. But how could the writer of one of the greatest works in English literature be autistic? Surely I must be mad to even suggest such a thing. Well, possibly. I'm certainly not an expert in Emily Brontë, but I have seen a few people with autistic spectrum disorders over the years. The concept of autistic spectrum disorder is a relatively recent one. The term infantile autism was first used by American psychiatrist Leo Kanner in 1943 to describe 11 children who displayed a powerful desire for aloneness and an obsessive insistence on persistent sameness. In the 1980s, Hans Asperger's work on children with difficulties in social interactions but normal intellectual functioning was rediscovered, and this combination came to be known as high-functioning autism or Asperger's syndrome. Concerns over Asperger's possible connections to the Nazi extermination program of disabled children led to his name being dropped and the terms autistic spectrum disorder, ASD, or just on the spectrum being used instead. There are many controversies in the field of autism, with disability politics sometimes clouding the science. ASD is a neurodevelopmental disorder listed in the International Psychiatric Classification Systems, but many autistic people and advocates see autism as part of neurodiversity, the natural variation in human thinking and experiencing of the world, and not a disorder at all. Personally, I see no contradiction here. The traits that are associated with autism undoubtedly occur on a spectrum of severity. Those people with fewer or milder traits are able to live satisfying and fulfilling lives, and often excel at many things. But those with more profound problems, who are distressed by their difficulties, or who are simply unable to function in everyday society, these people can be considered to have a disorder. Diagnosing autistic spectrum disorders is complex. The clinical features vary enormously, and there are significant gender differences. A detailed developmental history from a parent and direct observation are usually considered essential, but even then, the diagnosis still might not be clear. We have very little to go on for Emily Brontë, just a few anecdotes, some letters about her, and her own writings. Do these reveal anything about the workings of her mind? You might think that the answer is an obvious yes, and countless literary academics would agree with you, as there seems to be an almost infinite number of papers and books analysing her work and characters from Freudian, Jungian, feminist and other perspectives. And I'm grateful here to my psychology colleague Casey Bonham for pointing out this body of work, but having tried to wade through some of them, I was left thinking that they were saying more about the writers of the articles than Emily Brontë herself. This one, however, highlights how Wuthering Heights is utterly unlike any other novel, and how the psychological strangeness of the central characters has undermined their intelligibility, leading to polarised and contradictory judgments on the novel that are the most striking aspect of its critical history. Perhaps the reason Emily's characters are so difficult to understand is because Emily had difficulties understanding people. We'll never be able to say with certainty whether she was or was not on the spectrum, but it seems to me that she had major difficulties in her ability to mix with others and adapt to change, and that when she tried to overcome these difficulties, she suffered such distress that her own sister thought she might die of homesickness. In conclusion then, there is no doubt that Emily Brontë was strange. I think there is good evidence that her strangeness arose from the neurodevelopmental deficits associated with an autistic spectrum disorder. But although she struggled with this, it is what made her thinking and writing so unconventional and so powerful. A curse and a blessing at the same time. Thank you for watching. Please subscribe and click the notifications bell to be kept up to date with all the new releases. I'd be particularly interested in hearing your views and opinions on this very controversial topic, but otherwise I'll see you next time. Bye for now.